Companies need to have this compliance program or have visibility into their data almost at their fingertips. So those are the things that get me excited and rather fired up.
That was Vince Walden, CEO of Kona AI. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to the award-winning Data-Driven Compliance. In this podcast, we will discuss how to use data to improve and enhance the effectiveness of your compliance program, creating greater business efficiency, all leading to more return on investment for your compliance program. Join host Tom Fox as he explores how data will drive your compliance program to the next level. This podcast is sponsored by Kona AI, and now a word about Kona AI. Kona AI is the leading AI-driven solution for anti-corruption, risk, and compliance professionals. Our easy-to-use software and flexible, secure deployment models drive fact-based decisions that focus on the risk areas that matter to the regulators and your business. Whether you are looking for a solution that sits in the cloud or on premises, Kona AI returns lost money to your company's balance sheet and spots high-risk payments to third parties in half the time and half the cost. Conduct better evidence-based risk assessment. Reduce investigations costs. Enable your compliance team to present risk in a timely, data-driven, fact-based manner. Register for your free demo at konaai.com or email info@konaai.com. Today, Dale Waterman joins me to discuss the issue of data sovereignty in a data-driven compliance program. We touch on data sovereignty, data governance, data protection, and data privacy. I know you'll enjoy this episode.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode. And today I have with me Dale Waterman. And Dale is, or rather has been, in not simply tech, but data for quite some time. And he's got some great ideas, observations, and really information to give us. So Dale, with that introduction, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
It's my pleasure tonight.
Yeah, so that's a great point. Where are you as we're recording this pod?
Yeah, so thanks very much for inviting me. Yes, I'm based in Dubai. Just as a quick introduction, as you might be able to hear, I am South African, born and bred. I spent 10 years in the UK, and I've been in the Middle East here in Dubai for the past 15 with my family. I'm an attorney by trade. The bulk of that time, particularly here in the Middle East, has been spent as an in-house counsel for Microsoft. In that time, I covered the Middle East and Africa region. So for me, that was Turkey, Pakistan, and then down to South Africa. A number of different roles there over the years, quite a long stint that I did of well over a decade. So originally some IP and anti-piracy type roles. I also had a lead role for the digital crimes unit for the region. I served as the head of HQ for Middle East and Africa, looked after the local VP and her leadership team. And finally, I also had a role that was very focused on being lead attorney for digital transformation and industry. So very much more policy, regulatory kind of focused role than commercial was my time at Microsoft.
You're never an expert. You may not be practicing, but once a lawyer, always a lawyer. I wondered if we might start with your observations about changes you've seen in either the technological landscape or the digital transformation over the time you've been in the Middle East.
I think, and hopefully it doesn't sound like I'm sort of drinking from my past Kool-Aid, but I think from a technology perspective at Microsoft, and the biggest change for me was cloud computing. And I say that because obviously the company moved from a licensing company. To me, it was an Office and a Windows company, and it managed to evolve into a hyperscale cloud services provider, and also move towards a subscription model. So a big change. But why I believe cloud made such a change is I think it's cloud and that computing power and that storage ability that's really driven the movement towards what we refer to as big data, the analytics of data, and then all those fourth industrial revolution technologies like artificial intelligence and IoT. So in my mind, all of that's driven or powered by cloud computing, and it's made an enormous change in the world around sort of digital transformation. So for me, a big move.
Now, one of the reasons I was so intrigued to visit with you is you and your colleagues use a term I had not previously heard, which is data sovereignty. And as you guys have explained it, some component is about the transfer of data cross-border, but it's a little bit broader than that. So I was wondering if you can explain to us, what is data sovereignty and why is it so critical now for just a U.S. multinational, but any multinational?
The term is, I've talked briefly about the fourth industrial revolution, and you've got these sort of data-driven technologies that we're talking about. And all of them are predicated on an ability to access and process data. And they need that free flow of data across borders. And so the topic of data sovereignty, and I'll get to that in a second, but firstly, let me just start by saying, I completely recognize or call out the fact that nations are different. They're sovereign, they've got different cultures, they've got appropriate objectives that each of them are looking to achieve. I'd also say that there are certain kinds of data which I do believe should stay inside a country. But what we're seeing now is a trend where you're having these policies that are developing that are demanding that data remain within borders, or they use this term data sovereignty. And they can be used interchangeably. In fact, I use them interchangeably myself, but there's a slight difference. The sovereignty of data refers to the fact that no matter where the data moves across borders, and you can understand where we talked a little bit about cloud computing to start with, when the data moves across to that hyperscaler in another country, you still apply the laws of the country where that organization is based. So it's that idea of applying those laws. And what happens in this scenario is that you can use legal and technological means to make sure that you maintain the sovereignty in that data, even though it's obviously no longer in your country. And it would be things like encryption and key hygiene or techniques, which you would have with things like cloud computing. And of course, the cloud service providers, all of the big ones, they provide a number of standards that help you achieve compliance. And so they've not only done the global standards like the NISTs and the ISO type things, but they've also done each of the local standards in countries, which allow you as a customer to adhere to local regulations if you use their services. So that's sovereignty. The slight tweak on this is more a term which we refer to more as residency or localization. And that's where not only are you mandated to have that sovereignty, but you've actually got to keep the data within the borders of your country. And I think when most people talk about sovereignty, that's what they're thinking about, is that element of residency or localization.
Let me pick up on that a little bit and focus on the geographic region you're located in, which I'm going to call MENA. Others may call it something else. But at Halliburton, we called it MENA, so that's what it is to me. Nevertheless,
Middle East, North Africa.
Exactly. Yeah. How are those issues viewed in the Middle East, North Africa, and in the broader EU, US? But even within the EU, different countries have different views, such as France has a very strong blocking statute. And how do you begin to think through that and, more importantly, counsel companies around the differences in either geo-regions or in individual countries?
And I think it's useful for listeners to have a little bit of insight into how these sovereignty laws have come about. In my mind, there's three issues that I could share that I think shed some light on that. The first one is we've had this idea of data becoming oil, as you hear, and obviously it feels very relevant when you're in the Middle East, but it's a new currency, it's an asset. And what's happened is governments are starting to look at data as having value. They're probably behind the tech companies who were ahead of them, but we've achieved that position now. And the interesting thing about it is it all depends on who in the country makes that decision, because each of them's got a different perspective. What I mean by that is you can have a federal authority, you can have an industry regulator like a healthcare regulator or a central bank, you can have a cybersecurity national authority. And each of them's got their perspective on why they're seeking to introduce data localization or sovereignty. And that is often has unintended consequences. So step number one is we've got this broad global move by governments to aggregate data and keep control of it. And a lot of this is not negative. It can be quite altruistic. They're thinking about the privacy of their citizens. They want to aggregate data to use for local services or to support SMBs. But it can also be protectionist in some cases. And obviously it can be linked to national security, which is a big one, or perhaps access by law enforcement to documents. The second trend in my mind is probably like I'm going to call it a mistrust of big tech. and also concerns with access by governments to data. And unfortunately, in most cases, particularly when I'm sitting here, that tends to be a concern with the US. And that's not because they're the only ones doing surveillance, but it's because the big tech companies tend to be from the US. And so there are a couple of incidents that have, I think, highlighted this to people on the ground, the man in the street. So the first was Snowden. If we all remember that Snowden incident where he, as an NSA, I think he was a contractor at the time, but he put 3 laptops under his arm in Hawaii and went off to Hong Kong. And that all led to a release of a lot of information to the world at large around just how pervasive national surveillance was. And it wasn't obviously just the US, it included European partners, the Five Eyes sort of countries as well. And in fact, the Washington Post reported very strong links to some of the big tech companies in the US that were apparently sharing certain bits of data. So this has caused like a distrust, and you can see how that impacted how foreign governments started thinking about their data leaving their shores and then being hosted in, for example, the US. The other one that comes to mind for me as an incident is the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook. I presume most folks have heard about that, but obviously Facebook allowed Cambridge Analytica to gather data. With a group of folks, there was no consent. They used it beyond the purpose which they'd originally achieved consent. And they also profiled each of those people's networks. So they ended up with 80, 90 million profiles. And then they ended up using that data not for academic purposes, but to sell it for presidential and political campaigns. These are the things that kind of raised the awareness around privacy. And I think also caused quite a big push by governments around this issue of sovereignty. And then the last one for me is very quickly is GDPR. And GDPR, as we know from the EU, became a global standard or a high watermark. The interesting thing is, I don't want to go down the privacy hole, but what happens with GDPR is it classes certain countries as third countries. So if you're in the EU and you want to transfer your personal data beyond the EU, then essentially what you need to do is you either need to be an adequate country, which there were only about 14 as I can recall, or you have to apply certain measures to ensure that the country that you send this data to has the same protections, or you contract people. They're called standard contractual clauses. All of this, again, is created in this concept of sovereignty, where the data is ours and you can't send it our region unless X, Y, and Z happens. And unfortunately, GDPR has been replicated across the world because it was a high watermark. Lots of good things about it. And so even in this region, you've got GDPR-like or GDPR-inspired data protection laws that are being released all across the region. And each of them is introducing this idea of data sovereignty, i.e. personal data should not leave the region. And so the way that it plays out to your question, the challenging part here is that each of these laws is different. In this region particularly, maybe I can rewind this slightly. In my opinion, the way the Middle East looks at these laws, if you can imagine they're an oil-based region, they're thinking about diversity away from a dependence on oil in the future. A lot of this is based upon data and building knowledge economies and data economies. And a lot of the efforts here, regulatory efforts, are around alignment with global sort of best practices and norms, including data protection. But the angle here is slightly different from the EU, because in the EU, it's very, I wouldn't call it ideological, but it's principles-based, human rights-based. In the Middle East, it's probably more about adapting so that you can participate in this global economy. So it's very commercially focused. It's what do we need to do to ensure that we can attract business to the Middle East and that we can trade with partners around the world. So it's got a sort of a commercially minded approach, which is probably actually a little bit closer to the US side than certainly to the EU end of the equation.
So you've really identified the issues and perhaps even some of the problems/challenges. Kind of maybe flip the perspective now to either the counseling or consulting you would do, but to really focus on how do you counsel or advise businesses to comply with these very complex, overlapping, and even sometimes contradictory set of rules and regulations around data, and more importantly, the moving of data across borders.
And it's important to think about what the impact is of the sovereignty. So if we're thinking about it from a US business perspective, what I think has changed, in my opinion, for example, is things have been pretty tough in the US and in Europe. Growth for 2023 is not forecast to be great, but here they're probably looking at sort of 7% across the region. You've got investors thinking about looking south rather than just north, including the local wealth funds that you've got across this region. As you're thinking about, as an American company, potentially investing here, the key bit of advice firstly would be is to understand your laws. And they're quite complex and they're often quite contradictory because we do get a local flavor here. So it'll be GDPR, let's call it from a data protection perspective, it'll be GDPR inspired, but there will be local elements that need to be addressed and can be quite complex. What becomes tricky in this region as well is there tends to be less consultation at a government level. So if you think about GDPR, for example, what happened there was, firstly, you've had a privacy law for a long time. Here we're going from 0 to 100. We're not building on an EU directive to GDPR. What also happens is you tend to have laws released where you see drafts and you have quite lengthy consultation periods. And then you tend to have a reasonable period to actually implement the law. So you see it for 2 years and then you've got 2 years to implement. What can happen across the Middle East is historically, and I must admit it is getting slightly better, but historically you seldom will have consultation. And so the law just arrives, literally. And very often even the top law firms won't have visibility of that. And the implementation periods can be very short. They can be 6 months is what's being planned for the UAE federal law. Once the implementation regulations or executive regulations are released, Saudi is looking at a year. So that's complex. What I would suggest is definitely understand the laws. The second thing, and I think this is crucial, is to understand your data. It's really important to know what data you have, where it is, who has access, who it's being shared with. That's a foundation, and it's a foundation for any form of data protection or cybersecurity or data governance. Understand what data you have, then understand what your sort of crown jewels are or your highly sensitive data so that you can treat that from a risk perspective. Another tip for me would be, and it's a data protection principle in a sense, it's data minimization. Many folks will be familiar with this. But data minimization is about only collecting the data that you need for the purpose for which you're collecting it. And what's happening in today's world is we've got a lot of storage space, computing power. We're hearing about the value of data. We're thinking we might use it in future for analytics and to create value for our companies. So we're hoarding it at enormous volumes now. And the idea here is to have policies in place that minimize that, because if you can reduce the amount of data you collect, you're obviously reducing your surface and you're reducing your risk. So be thoughtful about that. The other one is what they refer to as de-identification or anonymization of data. And the idea here, again, when you're dealing with particularly personal data, one of the tactics you have to reduce your risk is to de-identify, to anonymize that data. Because in many cases, if you're, for example, a healthcare company and you're working on trials and you're aggregating data from around the world, and you want to obviously put that together so that you can use those cool AI algorithms and start doing the predictive analysis, in many cases, you're going to have problems with sovereignty or localization. But if you de-identify the data, you actually take it outside the purview of the law. And you don't actually need the people's names involved. What you're looking for is the clinical side of things. So you can use a tactic in de-identification quite successfully. Another one for me would be the use of standards and governance is important. And that might appeal to your audience. And by standards and governance, what I mean is there's this increasing responsibility. I think of it as Sarbanes-Oxley was corporate governance. And then you started seeing cybersecurity coming into the boardroom. And I think the next one is privacy, where it will be top of mind. It'll be a responsibility for the boardroom. And this is where standards are useful. So if you have something like an ISO standard, the common one for this is called the Privacy Information Management System. It's PIMS. It's 27701. It's linked through to an information security standard. But what this does is it sets out for your board what it is they need to know, what controls are in place, what policies do you have, and ensures that sort of general awareness at a boardroom level. So I think standards can be used very effectively to help you demonstrate to regulators or to partners or to customers that you're doing the right thing. Two more. One would be some thoughts around third parties. And I think in any form of risk, supply chains become quite a big theme, whether it's cybersecurity or procurement. But third parties is a challenge around data as well, particularly around data protection, because you can't contract yourself out of your responsibility in data protection or privacy. So if you're a controller of the data and you pass it to a partner who's a processor on your behalf, obviously they need to go to an adequate country or they need to have these protections in place. But at the same time, although they become responsible, you're still responsible as a contractor. So from an organization's perspective, you need to start thinking quite carefully about who your third parties are in that supply chain, because they're going to be responsible for adhering to regulations, including sovereignty. Who do they pass it to? Where do they have offices in the world? So that would be another important point. And then as a final tip, of course, it would be security. So there's always a place for improving your security, making sure you're looking after data the right way, because that obviously reduces your risk in a number of different ways.
Now, let me ask you to maybe turn your head just to the left a little bit and down to 2023, 2025, or perhaps even to what I now call mid-century, 2030, and ask, where do you see some of the key challenges down the road a little bit, perhaps in the shorter term, Q1 2023, but also a little bit further down the road? You mentioned privacy. I was really intrigued that could elevate itself to the board level. But what are some of the other key challenges from your perspective?
From a data perspective?
Yes.
In this part of the world, or for the Middle East, the challenge is going to be that you've got this influx of new laws and regulations. And the challenge comes from the need to change culture. So what you're finding is that you've got laws released. You'll have certain stakeholders in a legal and compliance community who buy into that. But one of the biggest challenges is having buy-in from your leadership team and understanding that topic, like corporate Sarbanes-Oxley move and then the cybersecurity move, elevating privacy to a point where it's becoming part of that boardroom conversation. It means you get the buy-in, it means you get the resources that you need to implement a privacy program, for example, and obviously the funding, because increasingly it's no longer just about governance and building out a program. It's very much about the operationalization of that program. And a key part of that is becoming the use of technology. So the days of using spreadsheets to track stuff are gone, and typically this is going to involve quite substantial investment. So that the support of your boardroom is key. And another problem that we will face in the next few years, not just in Q1, will be the fact that we're having these laws released, but the implementing regulations tend to follow quite slowly, and it'll take some time for guidelines to build up and for sort of precedents to occur. So to some extent, a lot of the law firms can give advice on what the risk might be, and they're, in a sense, having to look through the tea leaves a little bit. But at this point, what we're typically trying to do is build a pragmatic program that probably looks at it more from a global perspective. So you almost want to take that high water mark and build a program that will work for you as an organization globally, and then try to implement localization elements where they might actually be needed. Other than that, I think one of the growing trends will be, and I don't think it's a negative one as a challenge, I think it's a trend, is we're going to see the convergence of cybersecurity and data governance, which people are very familiar with too, and then also privacy as a late sibling to the party. But what we definitely need to have is less of a siloed environment. And you need to have these three disciplines coming together and working a bit more effectively. Things are quite siloed here. Historically, I think privacy is, you could say, potentially owned by legal. And then you've got cybersecurity, and you've obviously got a data governance team. These three entities definitely need to get into the room together and start leveraging on each of their expertise and working together. And I think that's something that we'll see over the coming years more and more.
And ask you, not simply the work you do, but really how you help clients think through issues like data sovereignty, cross-border data transfer, and evolving data privacy/protection laws.
It's a consultancy. We start with a consultancy service. So typically what you'd want to do is understand your position. Now, we don't act as a law firm, but we've got folks who've got very strong understanding of regulations. And also what's really important as a global companies, you want to leverage what you've learned elsewhere. So obviously in my region, in the Middle East and North Africa, we're very much starting, I think, the journey, but you can leverage some of the mistakes, I would call them, or learnings from Europe, for example, and implement them here. Typically, we would start with essentially some kind of applicability and readiness assessment, because what you really want a customer to understand is, it sounds a bit cliched, but it's not going to be a destination or a project, it's a journey. And so what's really important is that you start out by understanding the applicability of the laws, to you being really clear about that, often in conjunction with where we can partner with your outside counsel. Next, you want to understand what it's going to take to build the program. And that will be shaped by your circumstances, your geos, your budget, and frankly, also your ambition level. Some people want to do the bare minimum, and they've got reasons for that. Other people have got loftier ambitions. They're trying to drive trust with customers, build reputations, etc. And then they'll set a slightly higher bar and maybe a more challenging timeline. And really what you want to do at that point is you want to set out on a journey and make sure that your boardroom or your leadership team understands where you're going. Because if you jump in, like many of us do, a new law's landing, we know it's in July, we sit in it, and then come May, we start hustling, and it becomes a difficult 2 months as we prepare for a law. That sort of compliance-related approach, although understandable, it doesn't really allow you the time to think about your ambition and build that plan. So that's, I think, a key issue, is being a little bit strategic about what you want. And then ultimately plan a roadmap and think pragmatically about where you can reduce risk first, and then how you'd like to mature that program over time. And we would help with that applicability, the readiness assessment, working with law firms. We would also help with the implementation of technology and the selection of technology. We are very agnostic there. We choose what is best for a customer. And then finally, we could also help you once you've obtained an ambition level. So let's say whether it's privacy or data governance, but helping you maintain that position as well. That's hopefully a little bit from the consulting side.
Unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. Dale, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me. This has been a fascinating discussion of data sovereignty and a lot more. I hope that we can continue this conversation.
Thanks very much.
Dale, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me. This has been a fascinating discussion of data sovereignty and a lot more. I hope that we can continue this conversation.
Thanks very much.
This is Tom Fox again. I'm thrilled to announce that Data-Driven Compliance was recently awarded with a Medal of Distinction by the Communicators Awards of America. This is a huge honor for a podcast which only started in 2023. I'd like to thank all of our listeners who helped to make this award possible, all of those who voted for us, and all of those who listened to us. I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review to Data-Driven Compliance wherever you listen to great podcasts. This is Tom Fox. Thanks so much for listening, and we look forward to visiting with you next time on Data-Driven Compliance.